is now he had me. Now you heard his words. He stands on his words. He's about the second and the first. He doesn't want to see any infringement. Now, full disclosure, outside of that conversation, he did state he was kind of ready to back anything that President Trump pushed as far as gun control, and he was a supporter of the bump stock ban. I'm saying that just we're being open and honest about things, right? But that is the incumbent. That is the Republican representative. The second voice you heard was Jon Ossoff. That is the Democratic candidate that is running for that Senate position. And his stance is pretty much, he's using things we've heard before. He's saying common sense. He's saying responsible. He's saying, lock the guns up. He's saying universal background checks. He is saying that we need to protect the police, that manufacturers are just pouring weapons of war onto the streets. All the things we've heard before. The only difference now is they are talking to an isolated audience. Now they are really play. You heard. Recap, Rob. What are your thoughts?
So there's no doubt that Purdue's not a strong pro-gun guy. But I think this is an important underlying fact here as we talk about the Georgia Senate runoffs. I don't think that the Republicans have a really exciting candidate, to be honest. Loeffler is troublesome on a couple levels. Purdue is not exciting on any level that I can figure out. I graduated from high school in Georgia. I remember like Senator Sam Nunn, who I was honored to have a meeting with when I was in high school about some college options I had. He was a very conservative Democrat, old school Southern Democrat, but he was the last of that breed that I'm aware of down there in Georgia. And what we have now are very, I guess progressive is the word, although I don't like that word being one that gets used, but the word is progressive liberals running for those Democratic seats. And when I hear those talking points, so having set that as the backdrop, I think it's important to remember that I don't think anybody is going to go into the ballot box there or go to the ballot box on January 5th and split their vote. I think I've said within 0.25%, it's probably going to be within 0.1%. In other words, both Republicans are going to have the same number of votes within 0.1%. Both Democrats are going to have the same number of votes within 0.1%. I think every Georgia voter goes in there, and unless one of them broke up with your sister and broke her heart when she was in high school, you're just either going to vote straight Republican or straight Democrat. So it's going to be 2 or 2. I don't think it's going to be 1 and 1. 1 and 1 Republicans still win, but I don't think it's going to be 1 and 1. So I'm not even going to make an argument for, well, vote for Purdue, but don't vote for don't vote for Loeffler or one way or the other. I think it's both. Having said that, let's break apart we talked about the racism and the ties, and we know that's where Warnock's going. Let's talk about what Ossoff said in terms of those talking points, because I think it's important to break them down. We can't just say, oh, we've heard this before, it's all talking points, it's crazy. Let's break it down. So as I recall, one of them was the universal background checks. Well, the problem with universal background checks, and this is the reframe. So you say, well, isn't that reasonable? Well, first of all, before we get into the reasonableness of criminal background checks, before we have to go all the way to shall not be infringed and all that, let's talk about what universal background checks really are. Universal background checks really are the end of private transfers. The very first centerfire gun that I ever paid for with my own money, or earned, I should say, with my own money, was purchased in Georgia. Long gun, rifle. If I want to give that gun as a gift to my older daughter, 25 years old, I can't do that as a private transfer between a father and a daughter if there are universal background checks. Universal background checks really is code for the end of private unregistered transfers of private property amongst friends, family members, responsible adults. I tell you, you shouldn't be meeting somebody on the internet and going into a Walmart parking lot and selling a gun out of your trunk to somebody you never knew, never met, no ID, no bill of sale, no receipt, and just drive away. I think that's not responsible gun ownership, but I don't think it should be illegal. I don't think most gun owners do that. Most gun owners that I know that want to sell their guns privately ask at least for a copy of an ID. They get a bill of sale for their own personal records. Mm-hmm. They ask for a concealed carry permit, or it's most of the time it's somebody you know from the gun range. It's somebody you work with. It's somebody that you're family member with that you give a gift to. So we're talking about the end of private transfers, the end of the transfer of private property without a fee, without going through a middleman, without paperwork. And that's not America, and that's not freedom, that's not capitalism, that's not anything. So let's really call that what that is. The other side, one of the other things that was brought up was this issue of police are in danger. Well, if you remember, one of the best worst moments of this conversation was Marco Rubio in the post Parkland shooting town hall that CNN ran in like a basketball stadium, if you remember. And he tried in a very ham-fisted way, but he tried to explain to somebody who was calling for the ban on assault weapons that it's very hard to take that made-up term and apply it in any way that makes sense, particularly in a way that applies to how powerful a gun is. Because when you talk about regulating or restricting or banning my daughter's semi-automatic .22 as if it's this massive weapon of war, but you ignore a 300 Win Mag hunting rifle that can push through body armor and a car door at 500 yards, you aren't talking about what's more powerful. And these guys, these people that are pushing assault weapons as it's going to kill police and you can do this, you can do that, but then the hunting rifles, we're not worried about them. It's about 2 minutes after they ban assault weapons in their terminology before they realize, oh, you mean that's a sniper rifle? Well, we better get rid of that too. And we have to have a real conversation about this what it looks like being different from what it does or what it can do, and ultimately always come back to the fact that what it can do is only and always limited by what the person will do with it. And whether it's a .22 or a 300 Win Mag or a semi-auto or 30 rounds or 15 rounds, it really doesn't matter because it comes back to what the person's going to do with it, which means your argument about the more powerful gun eventually leads to all guns, right? That's the slippery slope on that. And I think those were the two biggest talking points there that I think we can break down in a way if we take a moment to do it in a calm and rational way, so that somebody who would be inclined to buy into the rhetoric, buy into the talking point, might hear it differently and say, oh, I didn't know that's what they meant. Yeah, that does sound like an overreach. That does sound like an infringement. Yeah, when you put it that way, we need to think about this, pump the brakes on that a little bit. And I think that's really important to have that conversation and break it down for people.
I think the other thing too, going back to the universal background checks. So you're right. Well, what you said, you're right. That's code for ending the private sales and transfers. Absolutely. Then you get into the financial costs, the infringements, and so forth and so on. There's this other thing that I think people really need to pay attention with that. Is if you're going to pass a law, you want it to be able to enforce that law, correct? Right. So how do you enforce if I sell Rob a gun? How do you know it wasn't Rob's gun in the first place? Right? We're not going to tell you if we think we're going to go to prison. We're not going to tell you that I sold it to him. So how are you going to be able to prove what guns he has that he should only be in possession of and that I shouldn't be in possession of? Well, you're going to have to do a registration because that's the only way you're going to be able to enforce who owns what gun. Because other than that, I don't have to. How do you know where I got the gun from, right? So you would almost have to catch me doing a private sale. You would almost have to. How's that working out for the black market right now? Right? So you would almost have to catch me doing that. The only way to really enforce that, common sense states that, well, we need a list of everybody's guns so we know what guns they should have to have. And then when they legally transfer the gun, then they go through the background check. Now, if you don't think the state's not going to charge you a fee for registering that gun on your new list now, you're crazy because they're going to charge you a fee for that. Right? So now you got another fee tacked on top. So that's another reason why universal is dangerous, because the only way to enforce it is through registration. It only makes sense that way. So nobody wants a gun registration because registration, this isn't hyperbole. This isn't something that's fear mongering. I just like historical facts. And when you go through the historical facts and things that just make sense, well, when we get tired of you having that thing, or we now make that thing illegal. So take your AR-15 or AK-47. Cool. We're going to just do a universal background check, which leads to registration. Okay. Within a year and a half, you'll get registration. Once you have registration, once we decide that that gun is no longer legal for Americans to have, well, we know where it's at. Now, I'm not going to say they're coming to kick in your door or whatever. I'm not going to sell you on that, but they still know where it's at. So maybe if you don't turn yours in with the stroke of a pen in a courtroom, you're a felon now. And so now you have an active warrant out for you for your arrest because you are potentially in possession of something you shouldn't have. So that's another slippery slope when it comes to those universal background checks. When it comes to him talking about the dangers of police and these weapons of war being used for police, one, they always tie in what happens in urban environments and schools. Those are the two places they like to pull up on the heartstrings. Schools first, then they'll toss in some urban environment. When you look at the simple stats of things, rifles of any sort are not being used and even a full percent of crimes the last time I checked. Right. So if you are going to have that conversation, you need to have that conversation based off the stats. And that's not simply the case. And then when you're looking at law enforcement is more in danger. If you want to argue that, like, what's dangerous to our boys and girls out in the streets, right? If it comes to a gun, like, what's more dangerous? The gun that they can see or the gun that they can't, right? So when you start having those conversations, you realize that handguns, when you are used more in crimes, are used more against law enforcement, are used more against civilians, are just used more. So I understand that it's going to sound really dangerous for somebody to come out and say, yeah, we want to ban handguns, right? But they got to start somewhere. Like, for example, with the magazine argument, right? This whole high capacity conversation they like to have. Well, what happens? Everybody's like, oh, well, maybe we don't, not everybody, but people that are kind of on the fence. Well, maybe we don't need 30 rounders in rifles. Maybe, you can deal with a 15 or a 10 or a 20. Why 30? You can have that conversation. But then it's like, okay, so what happens if you go to 20s? What happens to your 21 round Glock magazine? And so then if we're able to say, well, any gun that can accept a magazine of high capacity is an assault weapon. So what is your Glock 19 now? What does that turn into?